April 21st. I always wait until I'll wait till the last minute. She always wait till the last minute. Oh, and see, I'm on. Good morning. Good evening. Bless my heart. This is Wednesday night Bible study. My name is Doug Griffin. We're in Matthew chapter 26. It's just a few days before Jesus is going to be crucified. And last week we were looking over um, a, a meal that Jesus had. Well, a visitation he had with Simon the leper. He was at his house. There were 17 people there. The disciples were there. Mary and Martha, who were Lazarus' sisters, were there. Lazarus was there. Jesus, obviously, and Simon. So we know at least 17 people were there. And this is where Mary had come in and taken the bottle of perfume and anointed Jesus with it. And Judas specifically had gotten upset about it. He had said, "Why such a waste?" And he used the word perdition. And Jesus later called him the son of perdition, because that's what waste means. That's what perdition means. And Jesus later, when he called him the son of perdition, is basically saying it's a waste of a life that you got to actually sit and talk with the creator of the universe for 3.5 years, and at the end of it, you still wanted to betray him. And so, because people opportunity, and yet it was laid at your feet, and you use it in that way. One reason he did was because Jesus like reminded them at the very beginning, by the way, I'm going to Jerusalem and I'm going to be crucified. And they still just didn't get it. They didn't believe it. They didn't hear it. They weren't hearing it. Mary, Lazarus' sister, breaks this bottle, breaks it over his head, but pours it over Jesus' head. And he says, she's anointing me for my burial. And then immediately after that, that's when it says that Judas left, because Judas thought, okay, this man's serious. He really is going to sabotage himself and die. So I might as well give him up. He's of no more value to us. We thought he was the Messiah who was going to come and bring down the Roman Empire. Judas was a zealot. Like there was one other disciple who was a zealot, Simon the Zealot, and they were all about revolution, overthrowing the government, getting rid of the Romans. And if Jesus was not going to be part of that, then he was no longer any use. So it was when Judas heard it. Nobody else heard it. When Jesus said, this is for my burial. And they're thinking, what burial? 60 years from now? How are you going to keep that perfume on you for 60 years? But Jews were, okay, now he's serious. So he then takes him to be, he betrays him, and they say, what will you give me? And I'll give you 30 pieces of silver. And 30 pieces of silver is how much, it's the price that you give for a slave. It had been determined in the Old Testament that if you accidentally kill a slave, you owe their owner 30 pieces of silver. It's the least you can give. So that's all his life was worth to them. So from that moment on, Judas looks for an opportunity to betray him. He's got to get Jesus out of the way so that their plan can still go forward as far as overthrowing the Roman government. So we're going to start. So that was 6 days before the Passover. That was 6 days before the Passover, before Jesus' crucifixion. And now we're in verse 17. So we did the first 16 verses. Now we're in verse 17. So now on the first day of the feast of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying to him, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? This is Matthew chapter 26, verse 17. I will say that the synoptic gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those are called the synoptic gospels because you basically can lay them all next to each other, and they have a great harmony as far as agreeing about every single thing that happens. And you get the full story if you lay Matthew, Mark, and Luke next to each other. John brings up things that are not in those gospels. There's like Lazarus being raised from the dead. That's not in Matthew, Mark, Luke. So John is a whole other picture. But these three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all insist that Jesus ate Passover on the night of Passover. That makes sense. But John is very clear that he did not do that. And John's the only one that was there. So we're going to discuss why 30 years, 40 years, 50 years later, when Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written, why did they put the Passover on the night of Passover when John is very clear that he had the Passover meal with them the day before? So again, on verse 17, it says, now on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and that's the Passover meal, the disciples came to Jesus saying to him, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? Passover's tonight, and where are we going to eat it? John tells a different story. And again, John was there. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were not there. In John 13, verse 1 through 3, it says, now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. So he showed his love to them, even though he knew his hour has come, he's about to leave. He didn't panic, he didn't desert them, he loved them to the end. And supper being ended, verse 2 of John chapter 13, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, and Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going to God. So Jesus, knowing all these things, and again, this is before the feast of the Passover. That's the first sentence of John chapter 13. Before that feast, he says they're having supper, and when supper was ended, John goes on to explain how Jesus washed the disciples' feet, etc. So in John chapter 18, verse 28 through 29, after they had grabbed Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, they brought him to the praetorium. It says in John 18:28, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. So they're leading him to where Pilate is. So they've already tried him. They can't come up with any really good charges, and they're not allowed to pronounce the death sentence on anybody. Only the Romans can pronounce the death sentence, and they need him dead. So they take him to the praetorium where Pilate is, because he's the Roman officer. It says, but they themselves did not go into praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover, because they can't go into this Gentile place right before the Passover, and they hadn't eaten the Passover yet. So they literally shoved Jesus in there, and they basically shouted and said, kill him. So, and then the next verse says, so Pilate then went out to them, because they refused to go in, because they didn't want to defile themselves, because Passover was coming up. Pilate went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? Like, why did you just shove him in the room? So John is saying Passover was coming up, that Jesus had already had his supper with the disciples, and he'd already gone to the Garden of Gethsemane. They'd already arrested him, brought him for Caiaphas, and that night was going to be Passover. In fact, in John chapter 19, verse 14 through 15, it says, now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, behold your king. So this is Pilate, who has been interviewing Jesus and cross-examining him, etc. And then, so he says it's the day of the preparation day. That's on the preparation. Passover began at twilight, at 6 p.m. when the sun went down. That's when Passover began. So this is still the preparation day. On the preparation day, they take the lamb and they examine the lamb, and they make sure that it has no blemish on it, and then they slaughter it right at 6 p.m. And then they have their Passover meal. So they slaughtered, and so that's what they're doing with Jesus. It's preparation day. They're examining him, but they're not finding any fault. They're finding no sin. And then that night for Passover is when he is going to be taken to the cross and crucified. So it's preparation day. That's what he says, John chapter 19, verse 14. Now it's preparation day of the Passover. And about the 6th hour, so it's not quite 6 p.m., when at 6 he is going to be slaughtered, where all the lambs right at 6 o'clock at would it be the ninth hour? Does that make sense? So they're going to slaughter all the lambs, and that's exactly the time that Jesus, when they were in the temple slaughtering the lambs, that's exactly the time that Jesus was crucified. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." And they cried out, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate said to him, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." But they didn't sing it. So John is very clear that all this happened on Preparation Day, which is the day before the Passover, and that Jesus was on the cross and crucified at the same. He was slaughtered at the same time all the lambs were slaughtered. Deuteronomy 16:6 says, "But at the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide, there you shall sacrifice the Passover at twilight, at the going down of the sun, at the time you came out of Egypt," because that's what time they came out of Egypt. So at exactly that time, that's when you sacrifice the Passover, and that's when Jesus hung on the cross. So even though Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which is written 50 or 60 years after the fact, think that this happened, that the Passover meal that Jesus had with them happened on Passover, John is saying that happened the night before, that Jesus was the lamb that was slain on Passover. The reason for this discrepancy is because they had a Passover meal, even though it was the night before. They had a Passover meal the night before Passover. So that's why you get two different accounts in their minds. When the Jewish Christians were later relating the stories and talking about it, they just moved it to Passover night. It just made sense to them because Jesus led them through a Passover Seder, and that's what we're going to go through. So they assume, well, of course, obviously it must have been in Passover night. But again, John is very clear. He led them to a Passover Seder the night before Passover so that he could prepare them for what was about to happen, because he was going to be the Passover, that real Passover lamb, to fulfill all the prophecies. So he said, going back to Matthew 26, now I'm in verse 18, and he said, "Go into the city to a certain man, say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand, and I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples." So Jesus definitely kept the Passover. He just did it the day before. And there are 2 or 3 scriptures in the Old Testament where there can be exceptions, where you don't have to do the Passover on Passover night. And he says there's these special circumstances come up. Obviously, Jesus was not going to be able to have Passover with them on Passover night because he was the Passover lamb. So it was a special, I'm going to keep Passover with you, but we're going to do the meal a day early. So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. So let's go over what the Passover is. In Exodus chapter 12 through 15, we're just reminding ourselves what it is, because Jesus is going to kind of explain, give a new meaning to how they've been practicing the Passover. During that meal, things that they gave certain traditional meanings to, he was going to give a new meaning to them for the new covenant, for the new age. So in Exodus chapter 12, verse 12 through 15, it says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. Against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment, for I am the Lord." Here's one reason he was saying that, is because each of the plagues that God sent on the Egyptians was an attack on one of their gods. So they had a god of locusts, and so he sent locusts. They had a god of this, and so he was showing the Egyptians, I'm more powerful than all these gods. And so he says, I'm going to go against all the gods. I'll be completing it on that night. I'll be going against all the gods of Egypt, and I will execute judgment, for I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So he had told them to sacrifice a lamb. He's going to take the blood and put it over them. When I see the blood, I pass over you. The death angel doesn't come near you. So this day shall be to you a memorial. This is Exodus 12:14. So this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. So starting on the day that I pass over you, You're going to remember this night, and I want you to keep it as a feast. And it's going to be 7 days long, and you'll eat unleavened bread for 7 days. So he had told them how to prepare this Passover meal. So they were going to eat a Passover meal while the death angel was passing over them. It obviously they had slaughtered a lamb that day. They had a preparation day, and then they slaughtered a lamb that night. I mean, at twilight, and then they ate the lamb. There were bitter herbs that they were supposed to eat, an unleavened bread. He said, make sure you put no leaven in the bread. Now they had a lot of notice, so they really could have put leaven in the bread. So it wasn't about, well, you're in too much of a hurry, so that's why you can't put leaven in the bread, because God had given them plenty of notice. He was saying, there's a reason I don't want you to put leaven in this bread. I don't want you to put leaven in the bread. And he kept repeating it over and over. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 18, it says, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, and this is Nisan as the name of the month, not Nissan the car, but Nisan the month. On the 14th day of the evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st and final day at evening. So starting on the 14th, that's when it starts. For 7 days, no leaven shall be found in your houses, since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, where he's a stranger or native of the land. So there's like, he wanted to emphasize no leaven in that bread. Like, why? You shall eat nothing leavened. This is verse 20. In all your dwellings, you shall eat unleavened bread. He keeps saying it over and over. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families, and kill the Passover lamb. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the two doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. So whenever they would kill a lamb that they were going to sacrifice, they created this basin where the blood dripped down. So he says, I want you to, normally you ignore that blood. Don't ignore it this time. You're going to take these rags of hyssop, you're going to dip it in all that blood, and you're going to put it on the doorpost so that it's on the side of you and above you. Kind of in the shape of the cross, but they didn't know that, right? And he says, and you're going to dip it in the basin, strike the lintel and the two doorposts, so the thing above you, and the two doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out of the door of this house until morning. So stay inside, for the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you. And of course, when he sees the blood over us, we're covered by the blood of Jesus. Then we do not suffer that same fate as those who are rejecting God, who are rejecting Christ. So he sees the blood on us. We don't have that death angel that is going to bring spiritual death, is going to bring eternal death, passes over us. So he's trying to give them a visual lesson of the spiritual truth that is happening to them. And I want you to keep it and keep it every year, because I'm going to drill this into you, how important the Passover is, because it's going to be the thing that changes humanity. I'm marking time. Whatever the Passover represents, that's my mark in time. All humanity, all world history changes. And of course, we know that that's when Jesus came and died on the cross. He became the Passover lamb. That's why it's important that we understand he died on Passover. He was the lamb, and it was his blood that was spread, right? Okay, and you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. It will come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised, that you shall keep this service. So I'll tell you where you can have it. That's what we read earlier in Deuteronomy. I'll tell you where you can have the service. Once you come to the land, I'll tell you exactly where you're going to do it. Turn out to be Jerusalem. And right at 6 o'clock, right at twilight, at the 6th hour, at twilight, that's when you kill the lamb, and then the Passover begins. So when evening had come, I'm back to John, chapter 26. So when evening had come, he sat down with the 12. Luke says, when the hour had come, in Luke 22:15, he sat down and the 12 apostles with him. Then he said to them, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. So I wanted to, before I suffer, before I go to the cross and suffer, I want to eat this Passover with you. That's why. And he's going to teach them what it means. Because what's about to happen tomorrow, this meal, this Passover meal, is symbolic of what's just about to happen. So I need to go over it with you and what each element means, so that when tomorrow comes, and I'm on the cross and all that happens, it will sink into you and you'll understand the spiritual significance of what this Passover means. So he says, with a fervent desire, hot desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it's fulfilled in the kingdom of God. So this is going to be my last time having this Passover, and I won't eat it again until all of it has been fulfilled, everything that the Passover supper represents. So my wife and I have been fortunate enough to attend several Passovers. It's a beautiful, fantastic service with our friends who are Jewish. Um, so let me describe what this meal would have been like, because Jesus, again, is instructing them. I'm having this Passover meal with you now, and then tomorrow, the real thing is going to happen. This meal represents something. So there are 4 cups of wine that happen in the meal. There's 4 times that you drink, and each glass of wine that you drink represents a different type of redemption that is mentioned in the Bible. In Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 through 8, there are 4 different ways that God says he's going to deliver them. So in Exodus chapter 6, verse 6, it says, therefore say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord. 1, I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. 2, I will rescue you from their bondage. 3, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. And 4, I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. So there are 4 different words, 4 different types of salvation, of deliverance that happen. He says, I'm going to bring you out, I will rescue you, I will redeem you, and then I will take you as my people. And if we break that down, so they're captured by the Egyptians, right? So first of all, I'm going to bring you out from the Egyptians, which is exactly what he did. Then I'm going to rescue you, where he destroyed the Egyptians who were chasing them. So first he brought them out, but then Pharaoh's like, you come back here. And Pharaoh's army was chasing them, so God destroyed Pharaoh's army for us. He brings us out of bondage, and then he destroys the devil's power over us. Now, at any point, we could go back under the devil if we want to, but he doesn't have the power over us. When we were in sin, before we had accepted Christ, then the devil was controlling us. He had power over us. But Jesus is like, I'm breaking that. Just like you saw Pharaoh's armies destroyed, and you won't ever see them anymore. Just know that Satan's power, he doesn't have any real power. Only way he can get you is if you walk back. And they tried several times. I don't know if you remember the story, but in the wilderness, there's a couple times they said, let's make up some golden idols and let's go back to Egypt. Now, God can't stop you if you walk back into Egypt, because he gave us the free will, which is this wonderful and terrible gift. So you can walk back under Satan's power anytime. We do that all the day, Ooh, I think I'm going to do that terrible thing. Let me just walk back under Satan's power real quick. And that's when we walk back to Egypt. But he's destroyed Satan's hold. So he says, first, I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and then I'm going to rescue you from their bondage, and then I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. Now, this word redeem is similar to the word redeem that we use in 2 ways. There's a meaning of redeem where you compensate for the faults of something, meaning, we were having a terrible time until finally so-and-so showed up and they were so funny, they redeemed the evening, right? You would say something like that. Or, oh, we had a whole bunch of bad speeches in a row and it was redeemed by that wonderful person who came up. So there's a lot of bad going on, and then suddenly a good thing happens. So that's one definition of this word redeemed. But the definition that I think is more apropos to what we're talking about is when you regain possession of something in exchange for payment. Like his best suit had been redeemed from the pawnbrokers. He had to give his suit to the pawnbrokers, but he was able to redeem it. He was able to reclaim it in exchange for payment. And I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember S&H green stamps and that whole thing, but you go to the Redemption Center and And it's redemption center. And you weren't getting nobody saved, but you were redeeming stuff and you were claiming in exchange for payment, in exchange for payment. And so that's this word redeemed, because he says, I'll bring you out, I will rescue, and then I will redeem you. And each glass of wine represented one of those things. I will bring you out, I will rescue you, I will redeem you. And the fourth glass of wine, which is yet to be fulfilled, and that will be fulfilled in the kingdom of his heaven, because he even says, I'm going to drink this particular glass with you in the kingdom of heaven, says, I will take you as my people. And that's when he takes us up to heaven with him. But so I will bring you out, I will rescue, then I will redeem you. And this is when our lives were exchanged for a payment. And obviously the payment was his blood on the cross. He redeemed us. He redeemed us with his blood. So there's four glasses of wine that happen at four different times in the meal, and they each represent one of these redemptions for us, one of these deliverances or salvations mentioned in Exodus chapter 6. So in a kosher meal, and I'm going to try to, it's so fascinating to me. Because you got to see what Jesus was teaching them. It's so interesting. So they start with a kiddush, and there's a glass of wine that at the start of the Seder, there's a glass of wine that is drunk, and that's him who is, I'm bringing you out, right? That's what that glass of wine represents. And people wash their hands, and there's a Thanksgiving, and there's a plate laid before you with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, and a lamb bone shank is all set before you, right? So, and then the children are supposed to ask a question: what makes this day different from any other day? This night, different from any other night. See, my wife is actually the expert, and she will do that Hebrew and those prayers with those people. She's so good. And after like 40 years of my life, I've been doing 40 Seders for 40 years. I still stumble over the words. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 26, it says, and it shall be when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? That you shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households. So the people bowed their head and they worshiped. So they say this because the scripture says they're supposed to say this. And what does this mean? And at that point, the Haggadah is read, and they explain the story of the deliverance. They tell the story of how we were in Egypt because they want this story to be passed on, and then we were delivered and we were rescued, and all this happens, right? And there's a psalm and a short prayer, and then the second cup of wine is set before them. In Luke 22, verse 17, it says, then he took the cup and he gave thanks and said, take this and divide it among yourselves. So he's walking them through the meal. So we've had the opening glass of wine and the blessing. The food is set before you, but again, it's bitter herbs, it's unleavened bread, it's a bone shank, it's different things. The Passover meal has not begun yet, but these things are all symbolic, and they want us to talk about what they are, right? So it says, so when they were at the bitter herbs part of the meal, they were about to have the second glass of wine, but they hadn't had it yet. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 21, it says, now as they were eating, Jesus said, assuredly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. And they were exceedingly sorrowful, and each of them began to say to him, Lord, is it I? And he answered and said, he who dipped his hand with me in the dish will betray me. The Son indeed goes just as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man had he not been born. So he who dips his hand in the dish will betray me. Matthew puts that in. John's going to tell you how it really happened. John, I was sitting next to him. Let me tell you what really happened. So in the next verse it says, then Judas, who was betraying him, answered and said, Rabbi, is it I? And he said to him, you have said it. So let's hear John's version of that conversation, because they're looking at the bitter herbs, and Jesus, that's when he brought up, somebody's going to betray me. The bitter herbs, they have, their tradition says the bitter herbs are there because it, in the first chapter of Exodus, it says, and they were bitter because of all that had happened to, because of the oppression. But Jesus is saying, I have a new definition of what the bitter herbs mean and why it's there. In John chapter 13, verse 26, after Jesus said, one of you will betray me, says, then leaning back on Jesus's breast, and Peter says, hey, John, find out who it is. Then leaning back on Jesus' breast, he said to him, Lord, is it I? So this is John is asking, because John wants you to know, I was sitting right next to Jesus. And they're all spread out. All of them are, the table's actually on the floor. It's not like it looks in the Lord's Supper. We're all sitting at a nice table. Table on the floor, and they're all lounging. They're all, with their feet, they're all laying and leaning on one hand. So leaning on Jesus' breast is not a big deal. Everybody's leaning. It's just that John's trying to say, I was next to him. That's whose breast I was leaning on. So he said to him, Lord, is it I? And Jesus answered just to John, it is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I've dipped it. And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. So John knows what Jesus said in answer to that. No one else heard it. Otherwise, they all would have jumped on Judas. If they'd all heard him say, well, the Negro, no, he didn't say that, but the person who I hand this to next, that's him. And they would say, what? And they would jump. So no one heard this but John. And so he says that when I have dipped the bread, and then having dipped the bread, he handed it to Judas because Judas was on the other side of him. So the two people he had next to him on either side is John and Judas. Very interesting. So he dips the bread and he hands it to him. What did he dip it in? Well, during the Passover meal, at this point, you dip your bread into the bitter herbs. This broth they make of bitter herbs. So he dipped the bitter herbs and he handed it to him because that is what it represented for Jesus. That's the bitter part of it. And interestingly enough, when you dip for someone, you're actually giving them a place of honor. Because you hand the bread normally, and you dip your own bread, but Jesus dipped it for him, and that was in their culture. That was a sign that I'm really honoring you, and he's giving them the opportunity. Look what I'm doing for you. I'm exalting you above all these disciples. I'm not dipping bread for nobody else, just for you. I'm letting you know that there's still opportunity for you to repent. But Judas takes the bitter herbs and eats it and says, is it I? And I mean, as he's taking it. And because John says, now after the piece of bread, Satan entered into him. And here's what's interesting. We have a choice at that point. There's always a point where the Holy Spirit is speaking to us saying, don't do that. And the devil's saying, do that. It's like those cartoons that had a little angel on one shoulder, devil on the other shoulder. That's kind of the truth. And for some of us, well, for all of us, there's a point where we decide we're going to go with God, and we may stumble and fall, or we decide, no, I'm shutting him out, and we turn our back on him. And for those who are listening, I'm assuming, we all said, you know what, I'm going to keep my face toward him. I'm not going to turn my back on him. And though we may stumble and fall and trip, we're always walking toward the light. But Judas, at that point, made the decision, no, I am, because he still didn't have to betray him. He didn't, don't leave, stay here. No, I'm going to leave. I'm going to take this. And John says, Satan entered to him, says, okay, if you got to go, then Jesus said to him, what you do quickly. But no one at the table, it says in John, this is 13:28, but no one at the table knew for what reason he said this to him. For some thought because Jesus had the money box, Jesus had said to him, buy those things we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. Buy those things we need for the feast. Because tomorrow they thought they were going to eat the Passover with Jesus again. That's Jesus was finally letting them know, this is my last meal with you. I'm not going to be there tomorrow for the real Passover. I mean, I'm going to be the Passover. So they thought he was going to leave. Oh, John, look at Judas leaving. He must be going to buy what we need for tomorrow night's feast, to be even bigger. But no, John heard it and noted it that this is him. I want you to know, John, who it is. He still doesn't know that Judas is going to go. He doesn't know what Judas is going to do, but he still knows that he's going to betray him. Like, what? Betray him in what way? So Jesus says, okay. He like it says Satan entered him because he said, no, I'm not going to go with God, and his heart was darkened, and he left. So having received the piece of bread, John 13:30, then he went out immediately, and it was night. So now Jesus is going to go through the rest because remember, they drink the second cup of wine after that part, and the bitter herbs and all that's removed, and now the food is brought on, the lamb and the real meal is brought on. There's a third cup of wine that is waiting, and then a fourth, right? So Judas leaves after the second, after the eating of the bitter herbs. And they were eating. So now we're back to Matthew. Judas is gone, and they were eating, but they think he's coming back. And Jesus took the bread and blessed and broke it. So during the part of the meal where they are still explaining what everything means, Jesus is saying, doing a new thing. Let me tell you, you think that this unleavened bread is about we had to leave in a hurry, but I want to tell you the real meaning. So it says, as they were eating, Jesus took the bread, he blessed and broke it. He gave to the disciples and said, "Take, eat. This is my body." Really, this unleavened bread represents your body. Yes, that's why it had to be unleavened. That's why it said 23 times unleavened, sinless, 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 sinless. This is my body. In fact, Luke 22, verse 19 quotes the whole thing. And he took the bread, gave thanks, and broke it and gave it to them, saying, "Do this in remembrance of me." So they wash their hands again. They wash the right, and then they're about to drink the cup now that's called the cup of blessing. It's always been called the third wine that you drink is always called the cup of blessing in the meal, right? Each cup has a different title. The fourth one is the Hallel, the praise cup of wine, but this is the cup of blessing. So they've already had two cups, bitter herbs, the meal's being served, and Jesus breaks the bread and says, "This represents my body. My body's going to be broken for you." Okay, so now Jesus picks up the third cup, and they're going to have their third cup of wine. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 16, it says, "The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ?" Isn't that the one that he picked? Isn't that third cup, that cup of blessing, that's the communion of the blood of Christ, the bread which you break? Is it not the communion of the body of Christ? So after they've eaten the meal, he's taken up that third cup. He says, and then he took the cup and he gave thanks and he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you." So all of you drink from this one cup. We're going to pass this one cup. This is pre-COVID. So we're going to pass this one cup around, and he's going to explain what this third cup means. This is the redemption cup. I brought you out. I destroyed your enemies. And then when you pass through the waters, I redeemed you. And now you're in you're out of Egypt. And that water was a type of baptism, the type of death of the old you. That whole Egyptian thing is dead. Our old life is dead. And I have now redeemed you. That old life can't reach you. Those Egyptians can't reach you. You've been redeemed. And so it's the cup of blessing. So he tells them to drink it, all of you. Then he says this interesting thing that had never been said before in the Passover meal. And I want to explain quickly the marriage proposal. Okay, in the at this time, when a guy was going to propose to a young lady, he and his father went to her house, and she sat down with her father. So there's four people there, right? The young lady and her father, you, the guy, and your father, and there are four glasses of wine set down, kind of like the Passover, where there's four glasses of wine, but this is because there's four people. Wine is poured into both fathers' cups. Wine is poured into his cup, the gentleman who's going to ask the daughter to propose, but her wine is empty. Her glass is empty. And the bottle just sits there because she gets to listen to the proposal and see if she likes it. So he then um, has drawn up a covenant. He's drawn up a covenant, and he reads to her all that he's going to do. This is all I'm offering to you. This is I'm going to do this for you and that for you, and this is, and it's called the bride price. What's the price for the bride? This is what I'm willing to pay to have you, and this is what I'm offering to you. And he says to her, and then she listens. So she listens to everything that she's saying. I'm going to build a house. I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to do that for you. This is all that I'm going to do for you if you will be my bride. And if she likes it, then she pours the wine in her glass. And that's the signal to everybody. Because she can say, sorry. She didn't have to pour, next. She didn't have to. Now serving number 23. She doesn't have to. Exactly. So I don't know. Is it left or right? I don't know. But but if she likes it, she pours wine in her glass. And so now everybody's got wine in their glass. And then he offers her his glass. And he says, this cup I'm offering to you. And he's saying, this is my life. This now represents all that I am. And if you drink of it, you're drinking in my life. You're taking all that I have. And so then she takes the cup and she drinks it, and they're betrothed now. And from that point, he leaves her, and they don't see each other again because he goes to his father's house, and he builds on next to his father's house, because that's what they would do. They would just add on. And so he builds a place for them. I go to prepare a place for you. And he doesn't see her. They don't see each other. But at one point, there's the sound of the trumpet. It could be a year later, 2 years later. And once he's had it, the place is prepared. Then he comes and he claims his bride. And then the 10 virgins need to have their candles lit because they're going to get left behind. And he brings her to his house, right? So Jesus takes the cup, and he basically is saying, this contract, this covenant, because that's what he's saying. I've drawn up this covenant in marriage. This is what the intended is saying to his future bride. I've drawn up this covenant. Here's all that I'm giving to you. Here's the bride's price. And then she drinks of the cup. So Jesus says, this is my blood. This is the blood of the new covenant, which is what it's the marriage proposal thing. This is the blood of the new covenant. Now, that's not what they're like, no, this is the lamb's blood that's over the house. And that's not what this wine represents. And Jesus is like, no. 2,000 years ago, when I initiated this is what it stood for. This blood is the blood of the new covenant, which is shed for the remissions of sins. And so he's giving it to you. That's why the bread must be unleavened, because there's no sin. Will you drink of it? So Jesus passes the cup to everybody, and he's saying, you are my bride. I am going to prepare a place for you. I'm going to my Father's house. He uses the same words from the marriage proposal at that point. And they had never heard that before. But he's saying, will you accept, will you drink? Because this is my life that I am pouring out for you. And that's what the groom says to his bride. So, but I say unto you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now. That fourth glass, I won't drink of that one until the day I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom. So there's one more thing to be fulfilled. And they would drink again once he brought her to the house, right? They would drink again, and then, yeah, mazel tov, and you smash the glass, and you're married, and all that's fantastic stuff. Jesus is saying, this is my proposal to you. If you drink, you're accepting my proposal. I'm stuck. I got to build a house for you. You're mine. I'm going to come get you, and then we'll drink that final cup together, right? And we will party up in heaven. So Paul tells us first in 1 Corinthians 11:26, for as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you're proclaiming the Lord's death, because Jesus gave new meaning to the Passover. He says, this is about my death. This is my body which is going to be broken for you. This is about my death. This is my blood, which is about to happen tomorrow, if you can understand what I'm saying to you. And again, they're still waiting for, he's going to take down the Romans. I know it. But he explains the whole thing, and they're taking it in. They just don't know what it means until they see him physically do it. And then even then, it took a Bible study lesson that lasted from the tomb. I forget where they were going. But remember, the man followed them. Once they went to the tomb, and then the man followed them and went home with them and explained, and turned out to be that man was Jesus. And he went through the scriptures and explained the whole thing. And they went, "Oh, that was Jesus. Oh, that was Jesus. Oh, now I get it." And once they got it, he says, "Okay, I'm out of here." So um, uh, now they drank the final cup. They did drink the final cup and go out. But Jesus said symbolically, and they drank of him and went out. Um, but this cup that Jesus was stuck on, this third cup, okay, because he said when they'd sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and that's the final verse. So, and that's when the final cup is saying you drink that final thing and you sing, and the Passover meal is over. So they drank it because they didn't understand. But Jesus is stuck on the third cup, right? I have to fulfill this. My body has to be broken. My blood must be shed for the remission of their sins. That fourth cup, I don't get to drink with them until they're in my Father's house. When Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane, when he said, "Lord, can this cup pass me by?" That's what he was talking about. This third cup. He's stuck on that third cup. He says, "But nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done." So I'm going to go ahead and drink of this third cup too. And then that final cup we'll drink when we get over there. So that's the Passover story. That Jesus brought new meaning to the Passover and explained, here's what all these, here's this bitter herbs, that's Judas's betrayal. This glass of wine means this, that glass of the bread means this. He's saying you got to look at this all differently, because this was the original meaning. I painted that picture for you so that you can say, "Oh yeah, we're out of Egypt. We're not in Egypt anymore." And that's your spiritual life. And all of Pharaoh's armies, they've been destroyed, so the devil doesn't have any power for me. I can tell the devil, "Get away from me." And I passed through the Red Sea, and I've been baptized in the blood of Jesus. And he says, I want you to keep that image of your mind, because that is a physical representation of the spiritual truth, and the spiritual truth is more real. And I'm going to be doing that for you tomorrow on the cross. I'm going to be that Passover lamb. And so we're going to go from there. But I just wanted us to get a full understanding of Jesus, what he was teaching, and helping us to understand at this Passover meal that happened on the day before Passover. So thank you again so much for tuning in. And we'll see you on Sunday at the normal time. And God bless. And I'll talk to you next week. Okay, bye-bye.